Clara dabbed foundation over her cheekbone, moving the brush in slow, practiced circles. The bruise was fresh, deep purple bleeding into sickly yellow, but her hand didn't tremble. She had done this so many times it had become a ritual, an art of survival painted over with cosmetics. The mirror reflected not only her face but the silence she had learned to keep. Behind her, the bathroom light buzzed faintly, and for a fleeting second she thought she could still hear his footsteps echoing in the hallway. To anyone else, Clara was the elegant wife of Daniel Mercer, a man who owned half the real estate downtown and donated generously to local charities. To her, he was a shadow that never left. The world saw charm, the perfect smile, the generous handshakes at community gatherings. She saw fists, rage, and the way he would lean close enough for her to smell the whiskey when he whispered his threats. She leaned closer to the mirror, whispering the words she had repeated for years. "No one would believe me." The door creaked open behind her. Clara's body stiffened, instinct tightening her muscles before her eyes even found him. Daniel stood there, tall, broad-shouldered, the picture of a man who belonged in glossy magazines. He wore his navy suit like armor, cufflinks gleaming. His smile was practiced, polite, but his eyes carried the menace only she knew. "Are you ready?" he asked smoothly. His tone the kind others would hear as gentle. To Clara, it was a test, always a test. "Yes," she whispered, lowering her gaze. Her voice was steady, careful. He walked closer, brushing a strand of her hair back, his fingers grazing the bruise beneath the makeup. "Perfect," he murmured. "No one will see." Clara forced herself not to flinch. Her silence was her shield. Minutes later, the Mercers walked out of their home, a picture of elegance. Daniel waved to their neighbor, Mrs. Franklin, who was trimming roses by her gate. "Good morning," Daniel called warmly, his charm effortless. Mrs. Franklin smiled, her eyes flicking to Clara. "You look lovely, dear," she said. Clara nodded, the corners of her mouth lifting just enough to mimic happiness. From across the street, it was impossible to tell that her ribs ached with every breath. As they drove toward town, Daniel hummed along with the radio, tapping the steering wheel. To outsiders, he was relaxed, approachable, but Clara knew the storm lived beneath his skin, waiting for the smallest spark. She folded her hands tightly in her lap, her nails pressing crescents into her palms to stay focused. Silent, invisible. If this story resonated with you, subscribe to the channel and spread the word. And tell us where you're watching from. At the charity luncheon that afternoon, Daniel commanded the room with his effortless charisma. He shook hands, laughed easily, and told stories that made men envy him and women admire him. Clara sat beside him, her role perfected. The supportive wife, smiling at the right moments, laughing softly when he expected it. "Your husband is remarkable," a woman leaned in to tell her. "You must be so proud." Clara nodded, her throat tightening. "Yes, very proud." The lie slid out smoothly like every other one before it. Hours later, when the applause faded and the crowd dispersed, Clara returned home with Daniel. The mask she wore in public felt heavier than her makeup. She closed the bedroom door behind her, removing her earrings with careful fingers. The house was quiet, but the silence was never safety. Daniel appeared in the doorway again, his tie loosened, his smile gone. "You were perfect today," he said. His tone was flat now, no audience to charm. Clara nodded. "Thank you." He stepped closer, eyes narrowing. "But don't forget, you exist because of me. Without me, you're nothing. Don't ever think of running." Clara swallowed hard, her eyes fixed on the floor. She wanted to scream, to tell him he was wrong, but she said nothing. Silence was survival. When he finally left the room, Clara sat on the edge of the bed, staring into the dark. The mask of respectability was flawless in daylight, but in the shadows the truth was unbearable. She whispered again, this time softer, almost to herself. "No one would believe me." And yet, somewhere deep inside, a spark of defiance flickered, small, fragile, but alive. That spark would one day become the first crack in Daniel's carefully built mask. The applause from the luncheon still echoed in Clara's mind as she folded her dress into the closet. Daniel's laughter downstairs rolled through the house, deep, easy, magnetic. To the world, that sound meant generosity and warmth. To Clara, it meant vigilance. Daniel Mercer had perfected his mask. By day, he was the businessman who shook hands with city officials, signed oversized checks for hospitals, and posed for photographs that ended up in glossy magazines. His name was painted on plaques outside schools, engraved on benches in the park. Parents pointed him out to their children, whispering that this was the kind of man they should aspire to become. At home, Clara lived in silence, moving like a shadow, never giving reason for his temper to flare. Her compliance was the scaffolding that held his illusion upright. She had become so skilled at blending into the background that people rarely noticed her at all, except when she was at his side, smiling. "Mr. Mercer," a young man had said earlier that afternoon at the fundraiser, "you're an inspiration. Truly." Daniel had accepted the compliment with a gracious nod, his arm wrapped lightly around Clara's waist. "My wife makes it all possible," he added smoothly, pressing a kiss to her temple. Cameras had clicked in unison, capturing the perfect image of marital devotion. The flashbulbs didn't capture the way Clara's body stiffened under his touch. They didn't catch the bruise hidden beneath her sleeve or the way her eyes avoided the camera. That evening, when they returned home, Clara slipped into the kitchen, setting a kettle on the stove. She wore long sleeves as always, the fabric brushing against her skin even in the thick summer heat. To her, it was armor. A knock at the back door startled her. Clara froze for a moment before opening it to find a woman about her age standing there, holding a basket of lemons. "Hi," the woman said with a bright smile. "I'm Anna. My husband and I just moved in next door. I thought I'd stop by." Clara hesitated, glancing toward the hallway where Daniel's voice carried faintly from his office. "That's kind of you," she murmured, taking the basket. Anna's gaze lingered for a second too long. Clara noticed it, how her eyes flicked down to the long sleeves. It was 90 degrees outside. The air was thick and stifling. Clara felt sweat gathering at the back of her neck, but she didn't move to roll up her sleeves. "Beautiful house," Anna said gently, though her eyes remained searching. "Maybe we can have coffee sometime?" Clara forced a small smile. "Perhaps." Before Anna could say more, Daniel appeared in the doorway, his charm switching on like a spotlight. "Ah, you must be the new neighbor," he said warmly, extending his hand. "Daniel Mercer. Welcome to the neighborhood." Anna shook his hand, her polite smile never faltering, though Clara noticed the subtle tightening around her eyes. "Thank you," Anna said. "We'll have to return the favor soon." "Of course," Daniel replied. His tone was gracious, but Clara could feel the tension radiating from him. He disliked interruptions, disliked her speaking with strangers. When Anna finally left, Daniel closed the door slowly, turning toward Clara. His smile evaporated. "Be careful," he said softly, a warning hidden beneath the words. Clara nodded quickly. "I will." That night, lying in bed beside him, she stared at the ceiling while the air conditioner hummed. She thought of Anna's eyes, how they lingered, questioning as though she saw something beneath the surface. Clara's pulse quickened. It was dangerous, this suspicion. And yet, a tiny part of her felt a flicker of something she had not felt in years. Hope. The mask Daniel wore was flawless, but Clara realized for the first time that masks crack when someone looks too closely, and Anna was already looking. The night after Anna's visit, Clara lay awake long after Daniel's breathing had settled into its heavy rhythm. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that should have brought peace but only pressed heavier on her chest. Her body ached where his grip had left fingerprints, purple marks hidden beneath sleeves no neighbor could see. She slipped out of bed carefully, every movement calculated so the mattress wouldn't creak. In the dim hallway, she padded barefoot to the study. It was the one room Daniel rarely entered, lined with old books and a desk pushed against the window. Clara kept something hidden there, tucked between volumes of dusty novels, a small leather-bound journal. She lit the desk lamp and opened it. The first pages were filled with careful lines of handwriting, but anyone flipping through would see nothing incriminating. Each entry looked like poetry, metaphors about weather, plants, or shifting tides. It was her code. The storm came again tonight. The walls rattled, but I stood still. The sun never lingers long. Darkness is always faster. To Clara, every storm meant fists, every shadow meant fear. It was the only way she could speak the truth without being discovered. She pressed her pen against the page now, the ink bleeding as her hand trembled. The storm struck harder. I am fading. But someone knocked today. light through a crack I had forgotten existed. She paused, hearing Daniel stir faintly in the distance. Her pulse raced, but the sound faded, and she exhaled shakily. Closing the journal, she slid it back between the books, her secret heart sealed away. But writing wasn't enough anymore. Anna's lingering gaze had planted something dangerous inside her, a need to be seen. And that night she did something she hadn't done in years. She picked up the phone. Her fingers hesitated above the keypad, but finally she dialed the number she knew by memory, though she hadn't spoken it aloud in over a decade. The line rang twice before a weary voice answered. "Hello?" Clara's throat tightened. "Maya," a pause. The voice sharpened with disbelief. "Clara?" Tears welled in Clara's eyes at the sound of her sister. They hadn't spoken since their mother's funeral, separated by years of bitterness and unspoken wounds. "I just wanted to hear your voice," Clara whispered. Maya's silence on the other end was heavy. "It's been 10 years, she said finally. "Why now?" Clara's gaze darted toward the hallway. Daniel was still asleep. She lowered her voice further, words careful, veiled. "Sometimes storms last too long. Sometimes you forget what the sun looks like." Maya frowned audibly through the line. "What are you talking about?" Clara hesitated. She couldn't say he hits me. She couldn't say I'm afraid I won't survive him. She could only speak in riddles, the same code she wrote into her journal. "I just wanted you to know I think of you, even when it rains every night." The silence stretched before Maya replied softly, almost trembling. "Clara, are you in trouble?" Clara's hand gripped the receiver so tightly her knuckles whitened. She opened her mouth, but the words died when the floor creaked upstairs. Panic shot through her chest. "I have to go," she whispered quickly. "Please, just remember what I said." "Clara, wait." But the line clicked dead. She stood frozen, the dial tone humming like a warning. Then she replaced the phone and slipped back into the bedroom. Daniel hadn't moved, but her heart pounded as though she'd sprinted miles. That night, Clara dreamt of her sister's voice. The concern threaded into it. And when she woke the next morning, sunlight spilled across the floor, weak but insistent. She buttoned her blouse, long sleeves as always, but something inside her had shifted. The journal, the phone call, they were breadcrumbs scattered behind her. For the first time, she realized someone might follow them. Someone might find her truth, and Maya, restless and uneasy hundreds of miles away, would not let the cryptic words go unanswered. The days blurred together after Clara's late-night call to Maya. Daniel's mood swung like pendulums. Moments of shallow calm followed by sudden eruptions that left her breathless, always waiting for the next blow. But this night was different. This night would fracture everything. It began with dinner. Clara placed the roasted chicken on the table, careful to portion his plate first, just the way he liked. Daniel scrolled through his phone, frowning at something unseen. "This is dry," he muttered after the first bite. Clara kept her voice even. "I can bring some sauce." He slammed his fork down. "You can't do anything right, can you?" Her chest tightened. She lowered her eyes, murmuring, "I'll fix it." But Daniel didn't want it fixed. He wanted release. His rage was never about chicken or dinner or any flaw real or imagined. It was about control. When his hand struck her, it was sudden, violent, the force knocking her sideways. She tasted blood instantly, metallic and sharp. The room tilted. She stumbled backward, catching the edge of the table. But he was already on his feet. "Always making me the bad guy," he growled. Advancing, the next minutes blurred into chaos, his fists, his boots, her body crumpling under the weight of it. She couldn't scream. The sound caught in her throat. By the time he left her, muttering curses, Clara was sprawled across the cold bathroom floor, her vision hazy. The tiles were slick against her cheek. She blinked slowly, half-conscious, staring at the faint crack in the ceiling above. Pain radiated from her ribs with every shallow breath. For a long time she thought she might simply stay there, let the silence swallow her whole. But then she remembered Maya's voice. "Are you in trouble?" The words echoed inside her, insistent, pulling her back. Clara rolled to her side with effort, pressing her palms against the floor to sit up. Her body screamed in protest, but her mind was suddenly sharper than it had been in years. She could not survive another night. She knew it with certainty. One more storm like this and she would never rise again. Her reflection in the bathroom mirror was unrecognizable, split lip, swollen eye, streaks of blood down her temple. But within the ruin of her face she saw something else. Resolve. That night, after Daniel passed out in their bed, Clara sat in the corner of the darkened living room, piecing together a plan in whispers only she could hear. First, the journal. She had to keep it hidden. If he found it, it would all be over. She tucked it deeper into the bookshelf, behind volumes Daniel would never touch, sliding another book in front to conceal it completely. Second, money. Daniel controlled every account, every credit card, but Clara had learned to scrape away scraps of freedom where she could. Small bills from grocery money, change from errands, folded tight and hidden in an old sewing kit beneath the dresser. She counted it now with trembling fingers. Not much, but enough for a bus ticket. Third, timing. She couldn't risk daylight, couldn't risk him awake. She would wait for the deep hours of night, when his snores rattled through the walls and whiskey kept him heavy in sleep. Clara rehearsed it in her mind, slipping on her shoes without sound, sliding the door latch quietly, walking down the street with nothing but the sewing kit of bills and the clothes on her back. Freedom wouldn't come in strides, but in careful, measured steps, and yet, even as the plan formed, dread gnawed at her ribs. What if he woke? What if he caught her? She closed her eyes and whispered into the dark, "Please, just let me go." The house groaned as if in answer, wood settling in the night. Daniel shifted in the bedroom. Clara froze, breath caught in her lungs until silence returned. Her fear was a constant drumbeat, but alongside it pulsed something new. Hope. Fragile, dangerous, but alive. She pressed her bruised hands together, as if in prayer. She would escape. She had to, when she finally crawled into bed beside him, careful not to disturb his drunken slumber. She stared at the ceiling, eyes wide open. For the first time, Clara counted the hours not in dread of what he might do, but in anticipation of what she would do. And as dawn's first light seeped through the blinds, she knew the breaking point had come. Tomorrow, everything would change. Clara's plan unfolded in silence. She waited until Daniel was deep in his drunken slumber, his body heavy across the mattress, his breathing a harsh rasp. At 2 a.m, she rose, her bruises throbbing with every step. She clutched the sewing kit with her hidden money, slipped into her shoes and eased the door open. For a fleeting moment she thought freedom was possible. By sunrise she was gone. Daniel awoke to an empty bed. At first he dismissed it. Clara often rose early to tidy the house before he stirred. But when he checked the kitchen and found no coffee, no breakfast, no trace of her presence, a cold unease crept in. "Clara?" he called, his voice sharp, echoing through the quiet house. No answer. Panic curled in his stomach, not for her safety, but for the threat of exposure. He checked the closet, the bathroom, the backyard. Nothing. Her purse was missing. So were her shoes. For a long moment, Daniel stood frozen in the kitchen, fists clenched. Then he did what he always did best. He put on his mask. By noon, Daniel stood at the local police station, his expression etched with worry. "My wife is missing," he told the officer at the desk, his voice breaking in all the right places. "She's never done anything like this before. I'm terrified something's happened." His crocodile tears fell easily. He clasped his hands as though in prayer, shaking his head. "Please, you have to find her." Detectives took his statement, noting the absence of any obvious marital trouble. After all, Daniel Mercer was the respected philanthropist, the man whose name decorated plaques across the city. Why would his wife run from him? Neighbors rallied quickly. Mrs. Franklin, clutching her gardening gloves, told reporters, "Clara was such a sweet woman. Always polite. If she laughed, it must be because she was unwell." Others brought casseroles and words of sympathy, their voices hushed with admiration. "Daniel's heartbroken," one said. "The poor man." Yet not everyone believed the mask. Maya arrived 2 days later, storming up to the Mercer house with fire in her eyes. She hadn't seen Clara in years, but her sister's cryptic call still burned in her memory. Something was wrong, she knew it. Daniel greeted her at the door, his smile carefully mournful. "Maya, I wish it were under better circumstances." "Where is she?" Maya demanded, his voice lowered, sorrowful. "If I knew, do you think I'd be standing here?" "I loved your sister." Maya studied him, her gaze sharp. She noticed how tidy the house was, how polished his tone. It felt rehearsed, as though every word had been chosen to convince. At the police station, Maya pressed detectives for answers. "You think she just vanished?" Clara would never leave without a word. "Ma'am," one officer replied gently, "Mr. Mercer has been cooperative. There's no evidence of foul play." Maya's hands curled into fists. "You're blinded by his reputation. Look deeper." The detectives exchanged uncertain glances but wrote down her concerns. Still, Daniel's spotless record and polished charm shielded him. He attended every press briefing, his voice trembling as he begged for Clara's safe return. Cameras adored him, the community pitied him. But behind closed doors, cracks began to form. Alone in his study, Daniel paced like a caged animal. He downed whiskey in furious gulps, muttering to himself, "She thinks she can run. She thinks she can humiliate me." His mask was slipping, but only in private. Publicly, he was still the grieving husband, clutching Clara's photo as reporters clicked their cameras. Yet Maya's suspicion wouldn't fade. She had Clara's words burned into her mind. Sometimes storms last too long. And as the days turned into weeks, she vowed she would uncover the truth. The police had treated Clara's disappearance as a routine missing person case at first. But as days turned into weeks, the cracks in Daniel's carefully painted portrait began to show. It started small, details that didn't quite add up. Detective Ruiz sat in his office late one night, shuffling through the Mercer file. Something gnawed at him. Daniel's statement claimed Clara had gone to bed early the night before she vanished. Yet neighbors recalled hearing raised voices, shouts muffled through the Mercers' immaculate walls. Mrs. Franklin, the rose-trimming neighbor, had finally spoken more freely. "It was late," she told Ruiz. "I heard something." Like crying. And then a bang. But when I looked, the house was dark. I told myself I imagined it. Now I'm not so sure. Ruiz wrote it down. One inconsistency. One thread to tug. At the same time, Maya returned to Clara's home to collect some belongings. She lingered in the study, her fingers brushing the spines of old books. Something felt out of place. A volume leaned slightly forward, as though pushed deliberately. She pulled it free and gasped. Behind it, wedged tight, was a leather-bound journal. Flipping through the pages, Maya frowned. It wasn't straightforward. Poetic lines about storms, shadows, and fragile sunlight. But to her it was clear. This was Clara's voice. And beneath the metaphors, she recognized a pattern. Dates, moods, events. A secret record of torment. She brought it to the police, slamming it onto Ruiz's desk. "This is proof." She was afraid. "She was trying to tell us." Ruiz turned the pages slowly, lips tightening. It wasn't a confession, not in legal terms. But it was damning in another way. Clara's words painted Daniel not as a grieving husband, but as a predator hiding in plain sight. Meanwhile, Daniel's own composure frayed. He was used to admiration, to trust without question. But now whispers followed him wherever he went. Business associates exchanged uneasy looks. A charity gala that once would have cheered his presence now felt suffocating, the air heavy with suspicion. "Do you think she ran away?" someone whispered as he passed. Or did he? Daniel heard them all. At home, he paced the floors at night, paranoia gnawing at him. He poured drink after drink, muttering aloud, "She's out there. She wants to destroy me. She'll crawl back just to humiliate me." His anger turned reckless. He called business partners in the middle of the night, accusing them of betrayal. He screamed at staff, fired long-trusted employees, demanded loyalty tests no one could pass. And then came the discovery that struck deeper. Ruiz, digging through financial records, noticed large, unexplained withdrawals from Mercer's accounts. Money funneled into shell companies, disappearing overseas. Fraud wasn't what Clara had vanished for, but it exposed Daniel's empire as rotten at the core. Ruiz leaned back in his chair, staring at the evidence. "This man isn't just abusive," he muttered. "He's hiding crimes on every front." Word spread quickly among the investigative team. Clara's disappearance was no longer just a missing persons case, it was the unraveling of Daniel Mercer's life. Daniel, sensing the net tightening, doubled down. He rehearsed speeches in front of the mirror, perfecting his role as the heartbroken husband. But when he faced reporters now, his smile twitched at the edges. His eyes darted too quickly. His voice wavered in ways it hadn't before. Maya watched one of his interviews on television, bile rising in her throat. He's cracking, she whispered to herself. People are finally seeing him. Still, Ruiz knew the battle wasn't over. Reputation could shield a man like Daniel for years. But truth had a way of crawling out of the dark. And with Clara's words, the neighbor's testimony, and financial trails pointing toward fraud, Ruiz was certain the mask wouldn't hold much longer. And Daniel? In the quiet of his house, whiskey glass in hand, he whispered into the shadows as though Clara might be listening. You won't win. You can't. But the cracks were widening, and soon someone would push through them. The discovery of Clara's journal changed everything. What Ruiz had seen as coded fragments suddenly became a map when Maya laid the book open in front of him, her fingers trembling as she pointed to passages only a sister could decipher. She was documenting it, Maya said, her voice raw. Not storms. Not shadows. These are bruises. These are nights he beat her. Ruiz leaned closer, tracing the dates with his eyes. Every few pages, Clara's handwriting shifted, shakier, rushed as though written in pain. The storm came again tonight. The walls rattled. The darkness split my lip. I can't smile tomorrow. The thunder broke my ribs. Ruiz exhaled heavily. It's not a confession. Not the kind that holds in court. But it's more than whispers now. It's her voice. Maya slammed the cover shut, clutching the leather binding to her chest. Her voice is all I have left. Don't tell me it's not enough. Ruiz met her eyes. He had worked dozens of cases where women's voices were silenced, dismissed. But Clara's words felt different, personal, meticulous, undeniable once decoded. He nodded slowly. Then we make it enough. While Ruiz prepared to thread the journal into his growing case, Maya returned home with a copy of the entries. Alone in her apartment, she sat at her kitchen table, the pages spread out before her like broken glass. Every line cut deep. Her sister had lived a life of terror, hidden behind polite smiles and long sleeves. And Maya hadn't been there. Guilt gnawed at her until it was unbearable. She had been angry at Clara for withdrawing after their mother's funeral, for shutting her out. Now she saw the truth. Clara hadn't withdrawn. She had been trapped. Tears blurred the ink as Maya whispered, I should have known. I should have seen. The next morning, Maya walked into the police station with her shoulders squared. The journal was clutched in her hand like a weapon. She found Ruiz waiting, the weariness of long nights etched into his face. Detective, she said firmly, placing the diary on his desk. You asked for evidence. Here it is. Ruiz studied her, then nodded. We'll put it before the prosecutors. Even if it's not direct proof of what happened to Clara, it paints Daniel in the light we need people to see. Maya leaned forward. No, it doesn't just paint him. It unmasks him. Meanwhile, Daniel sensed the walls tightening. His paranoia had grown into obsession. He scoured newspapers, called his lawyer at midnight, demanded updates on the investigation. And when whispers reached him that the police had Clara's writings, his control cracked. In his study, he threw a glass against the wall, shards scattering across the floor. She's haunting me, he snarled. Even gone, she's poisoning everything. But his outburst wasn't confined to the safety of home anymore. At a community meeting, when asked about Clara, Daniel snapped at a reporter, his voice sharp, venomous. Cameras captured it. For the first time, the public glimpsed a fracture in the flawless mask. Neighbors exchanged uneasy glances. The grieving husband suddenly looked less like a victim and more like a man with something to hide. Back at the station, Ruiz watched the footage and turned to his partner. He's slipping. The mask won't hold much longer. And Maya, sitting in her car outside Daniel's house, gripped the journal tight, her anger burning into resolve. She would not let Clara's words fade into silence. If Daniel thought he could rewrite the story, he was wrong, because Clara had already written it. Line by line, bruise by bruise. And now the world would finally start to read it. The journal had shifted the air around the case. For the first time, Clara's voice echoed beyond the walls of her home. And though Daniel tried to shrug it off, insisting the writings were melodramatic ramblings, Detectives Ruiz and Bennett knew the tide was turning. They called him into the station. Daniel arrived in his tailored suit, polished shoes, and that same dazzling smile he'd used for years to win over crowds. He strolled into the interrogation room as though it were a board meeting he planned to control. Gentlemen, he greeted, adjusting his cufflinks. I hope we can resolve this quickly. My wife is still missing and all this. Attention. It's unbearable. Ruiz leaned back in his chair, expression unreadable. We just have some questions about a few inconsistencies. Shouldn't take long? Daniel smirked. Of course. At first it was routine. Ruiz asked about the night Clara vanished. Daniel repeated his story. She went to bed early, he found her gone in the morning. His tone was smooth, unshaken, but Bennett slid a folder across the table. Funny thing. Neighbors say they heard shouting that night, a bang, maybe even crying. Daniel's jaw twitched, but the smirk held. People love drama. You know how gossip spreads. Ruiz opened another file. And this, your wife's journal. She described nights of abuse, bruises, broken ribs. Now maybe it's metaphor, but you can understand how it looks when paired with your neighbor's statements. For the first time, Daniel's smile faltered. He recovered quickly, shaking his head. She was fragile, always writing fanciful nonsense. If she wanted to leave, she could have. That doesn't make me a criminal. Ruiz's gaze hardened. No, but this might. He placed a stack of bank statements on the table. Numbers, transactions, shell company names. Money funneled into offshore accounts. Investments that disappeared into shadows. Daniel's eyes flicked down at the pages before him. His mask slipped just for a second. Bennett's voice was calm, deliberate. We've traced millions siphoned from your company. Fraud, embezzlement, it's not just your wife's disappearance we're looking at now. It's the empire you built on lies. Daniel leaned back, forcing a laugh. You think I don't have lawyers? This is business. Complex, above your pay grade. You'll embarrass yourselves if you push this. But Ruiz leaned forward, voice low. You're not untouchable anymore. People are talking. Your investors, your partners. They're not covering for you. The silence that followed was heavy. Daniel's eyes narrowed, his smile gone. He finally spoke through gritted teeth. Clara put this in your heads, didn't she? She poisoned you against me. She always wanted to tear me down. Ruiz exchanged a look with Bennett. Your wife's gone, Mr. Mercer, and the only person tearing you down is yourself. Daniel shoved the folder back across the table, standing abruptly. I'm done here. Unless you're charging me, I have nothing else to say. They let him leave. But Ruiz knew the meeting had struck deep. Daniel wasn't rattled by gossip or whispers, but money, reputation, that was his foundation. And now, it was cracking. Later that evening, Ruiz watched the footage again. Daniel entering the station confident, leaving furious. He's slipping, Ruiz muttered. We just need to push harder. Meanwhile, Daniel returned home in a fury. He slammed doors, poured whiskey, and shouted into the empty house. His paranoia bloomed unchecked. He imagined Clara still alive, waiting for the perfect moment to destroy him. He saw betrayal everywhere, neighbors, friends, business partners. And yet, the more he fought to maintain control, the more his carefully built world unraveled. Reporters began sniffing around his financials. Former employees whispered about intimidation, threats. Business partners grew distant. In the quiet hours past midnight, Daniel sat in his study staring at the shards of glass from another broken tumbler. His reflection in the dark window looked nothing like the man on the charity plaques. For the first time, he wondered if Clara's absence wasn't his shield anymore. Maybe it was the blade slicing him open, and outside, Ruiz was already preparing the next move because once cracks appear, it doesn't take long for everything to collapse. The cracks in Daniel's empire widened, and soon they could no longer be hidden. What began as whispers behind closed doors spilled into headlines. Questions surround business mogul Daniel Mercer. Missing wife, missing millions. Who was the real Clara Mercer? Reporters camped outside his estate, cameras flashing each time he stepped outside. The same journalists who once praised his generosity now demanded answers, shouting questions over one another. Mr. Mercer, where is your wife? Did you abuse Clara? Are you embezzling company funds? Daniel forced his smile, but it no longer held. His eyes darted, his voice clipped. I have nothing to hide. My wife is missing and I want her found. That's all that matters, but the more he spoke, the less convincing he sounded. Neighbors who once waved warmly now averted their eyes. Mrs. Franklin stopped tending her roses when he walked by, retreating quickly inside. Anna, the newer neighbor, whispered to others, I knew something wasn't right. The long sleeves, the silence. His phone calls went unanswered. Business partners distanced themselves. One investor leaked to the press that Daniel had bullied him into silence years ago. Another hinted at threats. The man who once held a room in the palm of his hand now inspired suspicion and fear. At a charity banquet meant to repair his image, Daniel strode to the podium, rehearsed lines echoing in his head. But before he could speak, a reporter called out from the audience. "What about the offshore accounts, Daniel? What about the bruises your wife wrote about?" The room fell silent. Daniel's smile faltered, sweat beading along his brow. "Lies," he spat. "All lies. My enemies are trying to ruin me." But the damage was done. Cameras captured not the poised philanthropist, but a man unraveling. Detective Ruiz watched the footage later with grim satisfaction. "He's panicking," he told Bennett. "The mask is gone. Now people are seeing him the way Clara did." Back at home, Daniel raged. He threw his phone across the room, shattering it against the wall. "Parasites!" he shouted into the empty air. "They'd be nothing without me." He poured whiskey into a glass, his hand shaking. But as he drank, his paranoia grew sharper. He saw Clara's face in every shadow. He heard her voice in the silence. "You can't hide forever." At night, he prowled the house like a restless animal, muttering to himself, "She's out there. She wants me destroyed. She won't win. She can't." But even his own staff began to fear him. A maid quietly quit, leaving a note. "I can't work here anymore. It's too dangerous." The community turned cold. The man once praised as a savior of the city was now avoided in grocery aisles, whispered about in parking lots. Parents pulled their children away when he walked by. And through it all, the same question pulsed louder with each passing day. Where is Clara? Daniel tried to answer it with bluster, with press conferences, with threats against anyone who doubted him. But every word dug him deeper, every denial sharpened suspicion. One evening, as he sat alone in his study, the lights dim around him, Daniel stared at his reflection in the darkened window. The face staring back was no longer the polished philanthropist. It was a man cornered, exposed, and for the first time Daniel Mercer whispered aloud the question he had fought to bury. What if she really is coming back? The thought chilled him, because deep down he knew. Clara's silence had already become louder than his lies, and soon a courtroom would decide whose truth would prevail. The turning point came at dawn. Daniel Mercer awoke to pounding on his front door, his head heavy with whiskey and paranoia. When he opened it, floodlights from police cruisers illuminated his pristine driveway. Detective Ruiz stood firm, warrant in hand. "Daniel Mercer," Ruiz said, voice steady. "You're under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and obstruction of justice, and until your wife is found, you remain a prime suspect in her disappearance." Daniel's face contorted, shock mingling with rage. "This is a mistake," he barked, but his wrists were already being clasped in cold steel. The cameras caught it all. The once revered philanthropist led from his mansion in handcuffs, shouting, red-faced, to a chorus of reporters, "I'm innocent! This is a witch hunt." His words, once gospel, now sounded like a desperate man gasping for air. The trial began weeks later, the courthouse packed with press, neighbors, and former colleagues who once praised him. Now they came to watch the mask fall for good. Inside, the prosecution wasted no time building their case. They laid Clara's diary on the stand, each page enlarged for the jury to see. Her coded words, once private whispers, were read aloud by Maya. "The thunder broke my ribs." Maya's voice cracked as she read. "The storm came again tonight. I am fading." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The metaphors were clear now. They weren't poetry. They were testimony. Photographs followed. Bruises Clara had hidden, documented in medical records she never dared to explain. Doctors testified about her visits, her whispered excuses of "I tripped" or "I slipped in the shower." Ruiz took the stand next, presenting the financial records. Millions siphoned into offshore accounts, a web of fraud that painted Daniel not as a victimized husband, but as a predator who thrived on manipulation. The defense tried to counter. They painted Clara as unstable, Maya as vindictive, the neighbors as mistaken. Daniel sat beside his lawyers, his smirk returning whenever the jury glanced his way. He whispered to his attorney, shaking his head as though all of it were beneath him. But the facade didn't last. When the prosecution called Anna, the new neighbor, her testimony pierced the silence. "I saw Clara in the garden. It was 90 degrees and she wore long sleeves. She looked afraid, and I heard shouting at night. I wanted to help, but I didn't know how. Daniel shifted, his jaw tightening. Then Mrs. Franklin took the stand, her voice trembling. I heard crying. I told myself I imagined it, but now I know I didn't. I should have spoken sooner. The jury listened, eyes fixed on Daniel. The image of the generous donor was dissolving, replaced by something darker, truer. Finally, Daniel himself was called. His lawyer warned him against it, but his pride demanded the stage. He rose, shoulders squared, that same magnetic confidence he once wielded like a weapon. I am not the monster they describe, he declared, voice booming. I gave this city everything. I built schools, hospitals. My wife, God rest her soul wherever she is, was fragile, but I loved her. These lies are attempts to destroy me, but as cross-examination pressed, his temper flared. When Ruiz's partner asked about the journal, Daniel's mask cracked. Those words mean nothing, he snapped. She exaggerated, she lied, she wanted to make me look weak. Maya, sitting in the gallery, clutched Clara's diary tight. Tears welled in her eyes, but she whispered, Now they see you. The courtroom watched as Daniel raged, his face red, his fists clenched. The calm, smiling philanthropist was gone. In his place stood the man Clara had lived with every night, volatile, cruel, unhinged. The judge struck her gavel. Order, Mr. Mercer, control yourself. But Daniel couldn't, his voice cracked, spitting venom. You're all blind. She was mine. She belonged to me. The words hung heavy in the air, chilling everyone who heard them. The jury leaned back, eyes wide. Reporters scribbled furiously, knowing they had just witnessed the death of Daniel's public mask. When court adjourned, the whispers spread like wildfire. Daniel Mercer wasn't just corrupt. He was exactly what Clara's diary had described, and for the first time, the world saw him exactly as she had, night after night. The gavel had fallen months ago, but the echoes of the trial lingered in the city like a shadow that refused to fade. Daniel Mercer sat behind bars now, his empire reduced to rubble, his name synonymous with cruelty and deceit. Yet for Maya, victory was hollow. Clara's body had never been found. There was no grave to visit, no final goodbye carved into stone. Instead, Maya came here to the park Clara had loved. It was a quiet space, tucked between sycamore trees and lilac bushes where children's laughter drifted through the air, and the sunlight broke gently across the grass. Clara used to bring books here, losing herself in worlds where storms ended and heroes survived. Now, Maya sat alone on the worn wooden bench, the leather-bound diary resting on her lap. The pages were frayed from handling, ink smudged by tears, but the words remained intact. Clara's voice, fragile yet fierce, still spoke through every line. She traced her fingers across a passage, whispering it aloud. Silence is not safety. Silence is survival, but someday silence will break, her throat tightened. Clara had believed her silence kept her alive, but in the end it was her words that destroyed Daniel. That diary had been a weapon sharper than any blade, a record no one could ignore once it was unearthed. Maya leaned back against the bench, the autumn air cool against her skin. She thought of the jury's faces when Daniel erupted in rage, when the mask of respectability fell away and the monster underneath was exposed. She thought of the neighbors, once blinded, now remorseful, murmuring, "We should have seen." Daniel had believed Clara's silence was weakness. He believed her obedience made him untouchable. But the truth had a way of crawling into the light. It had taken Maya's persistence, the detective's patience, and Clara's own courage written in code, but in the end, Daniel had been destroyed by the very woman he thought powerless. Maya closed the diary gently, pressing it against her chest. "You weren't weak," she whispered. "You were braver than any of us." Around her, life moved on. Families picnicked in the distance. A child's kite fluttered against the sky. The world had turned its page, but Maya knew she never fully could. Clara was gone, and the hole she left was unfillable. But in her absence, she had left something more enduring than presence. She had left the truth. Maya reached into her bag and pulled out a notebook of her own. She had started writing too, not coded metaphors, but Clara's story in plain words. She wanted the world to know, not just about Daniel's crimes, but about the strength her sister had carried in silence. She scribbled a line at the top of the page. He thought her silence was weakness. But her truth destroyed him. The words felt like both an ending and a beginning. A breeze rustled through the park. lifting the corner of Clara's diary as if she were turning the page herself. Maya smiled through her tears. Clara would never return to sit beside her on this bench. She would never again laugh at some passing detail or tuck her hair behind her ear the way she always had. But her voice remained, in ink, in memory, in justice. Maya stood, clutching the diary close. She looked once more at the park around her, at the children running free, at the sunlight spilling across the grass. This was Clara's place, and now it was a place where her light lived on. As she walked away, one thought pulsed steady in her chest. Clara was gone, but she had not been erased. She had become immortal. The trial had ended, the verdict delivered, and Daniel Mercer was locked away. Yet in the weeks and months that followed, the city still buzzed with uneasy whispers. His empire was gone, but his shadow lingered, stretching into every corner where Clara's silence had once been ignored. Neighbors who had once praised him now looked back with shame. Mrs. Franklin, standing by her rose bushes, admitted to a reporter, "I heard crying more than once, but I told myself it wasn't my business. I should have said something. I'll carry that regret for the rest of my life." Anna, the new neighbor who had noticed Clara's long sleeves, spoke quietly to a community group. "I thought something was wrong, but I convinced myself I didn't know her well enough. I hesitated. That hesitation cost her everything." Her words echoed in the room, a reminder that silence is complicity. Detective Ruiz, too, carried his share of weight. Over coffee with his partner Bennett, he confessed, "I've seen cases like this before. Too many. You think you'll spot the signs, the bruises, the excuses, but abusers like Mercer, they hide behind power, money, charm. We should have moved faster." Bennett nodded grimly. At least the truth came out, but Ruiz shook his head. "At what cost? Clara's gone. The truth came too late to save her." Across the city, whispers of Clara's story spread beyond courtrooms and newspapers. Women read her words in community centers, shared them online, underlined passages from her diary that felt all too familiar. Her coded metaphors became rallying cries, the storm, the thunder, the shadows. Her silence had been survival, but her voice, preserved on the page, was revolution. For Maya, the cost was personal and unending. She returned to the park often, the diary always with her, its cover worn from her grip. She read passages aloud under the trees, not just to remember her sister, but to keep her alive. Sometimes strangers paused to listen. Sometimes women stayed after, quietly confessing their own bruises, their own storms. Maya listened, her heart heavy but determined. One afternoon, a young woman approached her hesitantly. "I read your sister's story," she said. "Because of her, I left him. I'm safe now." Maya felt tears blur her vision. For the first time, Clara's absence felt less like a void and more like a legacy. She wasn't gone entirely. She lived in the lives she saved and the voices she had given courage to. Yet at night, when the world was quiet, Maya still felt the ache of loss. She replayed Clara's last phone call in her mind, the coded words, the silence before the line went dead. She wondered if her sister had known in those final moments that she was planting seeds of truth. In his cell, Daniel Mercer stewed in bitterness. Other inmates had no reverence for his former status. He raged at guards, at walls, at shadows. "She ruined me," he hissed. "Even gone, she ruined me." He never spoke Clara's name without venom, never admitted what the world already knew, that his downfall was written not by prosecutors or detectives, but by the woman he had tried to erase. The city eventually moved on. New scandals replaced old ones in the headlines. But for those who had glimpsed Clara's truth, her story lingered like a warning. Churches preached about vigilance. Schools spoke about signs of abuse. Community centers passed her diary around like scripture. On a crisp evening, Maya stood alone in the park, the last pages of the diary open in her hands. She read Clara's words softly, letting them drift into the air. "Someday silence will break. Someday my voice will be heard." She closed the book, pressing it to her chest. "You were right," she whispered, and as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold, the narrator's voice settled over the city like a truth no one could ignore. Sometimes, the dead speak louder than the living. If this story resonated with you, subscribe to the channel and spread the word, and tell us where you're watching from.